Welcome to episode 2 of ArableAware, a podcast from Adama Agricultural Solutions UK. My name is Russell Goldsmith, and once again we're out and about on location to record the show. This time we've come to Madewell in Northamptonshire to visit Mill Farm, where our host for this morning is Tom Peabody. I'm also pleased to welcome back to the show what I guess we can now call our resident technical specialists, Adama's David Roberts and Andy Bailey, who we'll hear from in a short while. Coming up on this episode, we're focusing on how things are looking after, I think it's fair to say, a mixed spring in terms of weather, and we'll be chatting to Tom about how his crops are doing here. Plus we'll also be once again getting the views of two other young growers, Richard Cobbold from Norfolk and James Turner, who is based in Shropshire. Plus we'll have an exclusive interview about the Rural Youth Project that I recorded yesterday with Sarah Allison. She is volunteering on the project. The Rural Youth Project is an initiative that has been recently set up to better understand and support the needs, desires and challenges of rural youth, and I have to say it's a great interview that we got lined up. So another packed show, but before we get stuck into it, I just wanted to thank all of you for your feedback from our first episode, which has been really great to receive. We've had hundreds of listeners download the show already, naturally the majority here in the UK, but word has already made it out as far and wide as US, Australia and New Zealand, and from Brazil to the UAE and Israel, as well as, of course, plenty of countries across Europe. So thanks to all our listeners from around the world. Please do keep sending us your feedback as we're taking account of all your comments as we produce the series. But on to today's show. So Tom, Andy and David, welcome to the show. We're going to take a wander through your fields. Tom, let's first of all start with you. First of all, thanks very much for hosting us this morning. Can you give us a little intro to Mill Farm?
Yeah, we're here at Mill Farm, as you say, in Northamptonshire. We are a mixed farming family organisation. We mix of sheep and predominantly arable. Based here from Madewell, we contract farming over a sort of 20-mile spread really.
And what about the crops and varieties that you've got here?
So we grow winter wheat, winter oilseed rape, spring beans and spring barley. Occasionally grow some winter barley, but none this year. Our winter wheat varieties are a mix of qualities really. So we're growing some Group 1 full spec milling wheat, which is Skyfall this year. Some Lily, a small amount of Siskin, and then Graham and Revelation. The winter oilseed rape is split between Exalt and Extrovert. We're growing spring barley for malting home, hopefully, and that is all Propino this time. Spring beans are all the old faithful Fuego, which we don't seem to be able to better.
And we're out walking through your winter wheat field at the moment. How are things looking?
So this is a field of Lily, KWS Lily, that was drilled in the second week of October after a spring bean crop last year. So yeah, this isn't looking too bad. We have had a pretty challenging spring, as I'm sure we're going to cover in a little while. But no, in terms of this crop itself, we're reasonably pleased with how this is looking.
Well, we're going to chat with David and Andy shortly about key timings for fungicides and herbicides as we move into the summer. But following our format from the last episode, earlier this week I caught up with two more young growers to get an understanding of how things are looking on their farms. We began in Norfolk with Richard Cobbold, who is estate manager at Home Farm in South Pickenham in Swaffham. And I started by asking him which crops and varieties he was growing.
One of the major parts of the farm is we let out 550 hectares of spring cropping for a local veg producer, which they do. On top of that, we grow wheat, where the varieties are Grafton, which fits in as our early variety. We also grow Siskin, Santiago and Skyfall, and all of these are grown for feed wheat because we have a large grain store business where a local company rent the grain store, so we tend to trade them as feed wheat on the futures market. That's the reason for that on the wheats. Winter barley is all hybrid bazooka. Our spring barley option is Propino, sold for malting again to a local company. The oilseed rape varieties of choice this year are Elgar, Picto and Extrovert. We also have sugar beet, and we grow vining peas for Aylsham growers, of which the variety of peas we grow in there is Boston, which is an early vining pea variety. The spring barley was drilled in the third week in March. With the colder, wetter weather, it came up very slowly. At present, it's all up, and there doesn't appear to be any real disease issues. But so we will be sticking with our sort of standard fungicide, maybe looking to roll back on it. At the moment, probably looking at maybe a first spray of like a Fandango type approach, a second spray, maybe depending on disease control, a Siltra. But obviously, with the season, there doesn't seem to be much disease in there as yet. The crops this spring are looking fairly good on disease levels. The wheats are really very clean, and as a result, we've been looking at maybe sort of reducing some of our input costs, etc. there on that front. The T0 on the farm, we managed to get all of the early Grafton wheats that were planted done with a T0, based on sort of a chlorothalonil and a triazole. Those that weren't were either late planted after spring crops, which obviously reduces the disease level anyway, and we probably were looking at not putting on a T0 anyway. But looking at, even with the lower disease in the crops at the moment, I think we're going to go with a fairly robust SDI type approach for T1, just to cover the fact that we've had nothing on them so far. So yes, we will go more robust at the moment, with a base of chlorothalonil as a multi-site for sort of the overall cover. The weed mapping on the farm, on our heavier land end, we are sort of mapping it in our minds, really. We haven't actually, within our gatekeeper approach, we are trying to map the weeds where we see it, where we know there's weeds, where the sprayer operator knows there's weeds. On the lighter land end, as I mentioned earlier, with all the vegetable crops in it and the de-stoning, it's very difficult to weed map, because when a de-stoner comes through a field, it does weird and wonderful things to a field. So on that front, it's very difficult. But certainly on the heavier land, we have groundsel issues is a big issue, poppies are an issue, and of course there is some black grass. But with our very sort of heavy leaning towards a lot of spring cropping with the veg, obviously black grass is not a problem that a lot of people will have in the country. With regards to resistance testing on the farm, obviously black grass is the obvious one. Because of the large amount of spring cropping in the rotation, black grass is not too much of an issue here at Pickenham. But this year we've started to see a couple of the heavier landfills where there's a bit more where we hadn't expected it. So in the past, the usual chemistries have tended to work and clean the fields up. This year we've sprayed again with a Atlantis Hatra type chemical. Whatever we get left after that, we will go in and rogue out, and we will have seeds tested on that front. The only one I'm slightly concerned about as well is also poppies, where if we see anything that's come through this year, again, we will probably get seeds tested on poppies. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to appear to be too much problem to go after, really. Over the next 2 months, I think the critical actions on the farm really, obviously, is with the weather as it is now, Septoria isn't showing in the crop, but obviously it can sit there for 3 weeks in the crop before it starts to show. So I think referring back to what was said earlier, the T1, T2 are very, very important sprays here now to get wheat crops through. And an important aspect of that is controlling our spend, because we are on sort of Breckland light land, and obviously there's a limit to the yield that we can get. Sugar beet herbicide approach and spraying, with it being late, I've always had a fairly robust attack on beet, as in go fairly strong and knock the weeds out early. This year, probably going to have to go a bit more softly on that front because of the later emergence. I don't want to check the beet at all this year and get them on. So the beet herbicide approach is very, very important over the next sort of month, 5 weeks. And also big for this year now, from my perspective, from a management perspective, is looking what's in the field, making a judgment on disease, how things are going, how the fertiliser's working, and starting to plan ahead for next year as far as varieties and things. From my perspective, that's a very, very big thing. And also on the farm, that is slightly different. We have 600 head of organic cattle, and we have to do the grassland for that. So from my perspective as well, grassland management and trying to get it to grow so we can feed cows next year is also a big, big thing over the next sort of couple of months.
So I'm James Turner, farm manager for Stratton Parker, and the farm is Downton Hall, and that's in Ludlow in South Shropshire. So we grow a rotation which includes winter wheat, of which we've just had a little bit of a shake-up on varieties this year. So in the moment in the ground we've got Bennington, Graham and Siskin. And then alongside that we grow winter oats, which is just a stalwart variety, Muscani. We also grow winter barley, which is Cassia. Small area of spring barley this year as well, which is Planet. And we also grow oilseed rape, which we've split this year between Exalt and a Clearfield variety called Phoenix. Yeah, so luckily we ended up getting our spring barley in the ground a week last Thursday, which was a lovely sunny day with a little bit of moisture left in the seed bed. And it was a lot later than what we'd originally planned. I mean, ideally, we would like to get it in by the end of March. But I think having spoken to a few colleagues and some other farmers locally, some people that were lucky enough to get on in March, it still hasn't really come up in any sort of reliable form yet. So our spring barley should be up now. We went to have a look yesterday and we've got it up in the rows. So I'm hoping that, whatever time we've lost, we'll sort of pick up in early growth. We got it in luckily just in time for the rain last week. So sorry to anybody else out there who's a bit disappointed about that last week, but we were very pleased. It's given it a very good start. Fungicide wise, I think what we'll do now is we've made sure there's plenty of fertility underneath it, so we get it away nicely. And I think really we'll make a decision on how much we spend on fungicides and on other inputs for that matter, according to what the weather does now. I'm slightly dreading it burning up and drying up again as it did last year in May, early June, because that would really, after a late drilling start as well, that would really sort of hamper the crop's potential. So I think all of our cost decisions this year are going to be based on sort of a real-time sort of monitoring of where we think the crop's up to, really. But fingers crossed, our other crops that are in the ground now, disease pressure looks pretty low. So hopefully if we carry on in that vein, our fungicide spend will be, minimal really this year. Yeah, so I suppose in terms of disease in the autumn crops, we're in that slightly sticky position really with T0 applications as to whether to do it or not. In the end, we decided we would do it because we had the sprays in the shed. And there's certain other things that we tried to deal with at T0 as well, including wild oat control. We thought on balance it was worth putting it on. But I know there's a lot of other growers out there who perhaps would have skipped T0 this year, either, having been forced to or just to try and sort of cut some of the cost out. But certainly in terms of disease pressure at the moment is pretty minimal. Any septoria that we're seeing, which is our sort of key disease in this part of the world, is old infection, which has sort of killed off younger leaves. But we're not seeing too much infection on the new leaves that are growing now. And we're not in a high-risk rust area anyway, but it's something we will keep an eye on this time. I think just because of the way the weather's been the last couple of weeks, we might start to see a little bit of infection creeping in. I think in terms of priorities for our sort of balance of cropping now will be monitoring the effect of our slightly sort of erratic fertiliser applications, which have been very much influenced by the weather. We ended up giving everything 2 big doses of, first K-nitro and secondly Nitram, which it wasn't ideal at all. And I think particularly the second lot that went on, it would have really taken it up because the crops are actively growing. There's plenty of moisture in the seed, in the soil and some sunshine overhead. So I think the biggest consideration this year for us will be growth regulator in terms of timing, dose rates. I think those are going to be really critical, particularly now in sort of going from T1 onwards, because we could end up with some serious lodging problems this year otherwise, just from sort of early decisions that were forced by the weather.
So Andy, what's your thoughts on what Richard and James had to say there?
I think quite interesting in terms of certainly the different varieties which have been grown. I can see that between both James and Richard there's quite a bit of septoria resistance built into these varieties. Although Richard is growing Santiago, which we know is quite susceptible, so that'll present its own challenges. I think very generally their approach has been to try and work as effectively as possible with a challenging spring. There's a mixture where some of their T-knots have gone on as planned and some have not. And I think one thing that jumps out at me, and we'll maybe discuss this with Tom, is that perhaps in some areas where people have planned a T0, not been able to get on, they may have been tempted because they haven't put any fungicide on there to go a little earlier than normal with a T1. And I think for me this year, it's going to be key about the interval from your T1 to your T2, and I think in some situations we might find that if that interval is going a bit beyond 3 weeks this year, growers may have to consider whether there's an option there to go back in and do a T1.5 and protect leaf 2 in some situations. Right. By all means, it's not going to be needed everywhere, but it's going to be very much, I get the feeling from James and Richard that they'll be very much looking at fields and varieties on a case-by-case basis and adjusting programmes accordingly.
And David?
Yeah, very interested to hear from both Richard and James, both making some very good points. Very pleased that James has managed to incorporate his wild oat control at his T0. Richard obviously got a very good approach to his weed control. Because of the mixed cropping with the veg and the spring cultivations, then blackgrass hasn't become such of a problem, but he's clearly recognising how this can build, and the fact that he's already doing roguing is very pleasing to hear, because that is a cultural method that we shouldn't ignore. It's a good way of keeping on top of building blackgrass problems. If you've got extensive problems, then it'd be quite a heartbreaking job to approach, but starting it early is the right approach. The roguing, combining that with where herbicide performance perhaps has been less good than anticipated, and taking the next step and having resistance testing done is equally important as well. So it's very pleasing to hear the approach of both Richard and James when it comes to their herbicide strategy.
And Tom, it would be good to get a similar update from yourself. Has the very weather during spring had any impact on your crops at all, and how are they looking in terms of disease levels?
Yeah, I mean it's had a huge impact on our crops and our cropping. We're almost a quarter spring cropping, as discussed earlier, spring barley and spring beans, due to the blackgrass issues that we face in this area. We have managed to get all of our spring beans drilled, finished on Monday last week, which is as late as we've been for as long as any of us can remember. We're glad we waited. They've gone into really good conditions. We've got some lighter land over towards Northampton, which we managed to get drilled with spring barley a fortnight, 3 weeks ago. That's up and looks very well, but we've still got quite a big chunk of heavier land spring barley to drill.
Could I ask Tom, the inclusion of the spring barley in the rotation, is that something that was always present, or was it always present and has increased? Bearing in mind the usefulness of that when it comes to addressing blackgrass problems, has the area of spring barley increased?
Yeah, it's fair to say it's dramatically increased. So we started growing spring barley 7 or 8 years ago probably, and at that time we were ploughing and pressing in the autumn in September for that crop, and also ploughing in our rotation for spring beans. Over the last 3 or 4 years we've sort of experimented with spring wheat and spring barley, with varying our cultivations ahead of those spring cereal crops, to see if we can cut down to one plough in our 5 or 6 year rotation. Cover crops have been a big part of this, and that's proving to be relatively successful. We haven't been able to replicate the yields that we've seen in trials and on other farms with spring wheat, so we've sort of left that a couple of years ago and moved wholly onto spring barley, and we seem to be getting on quite well with that.
Okay, and it's interesting that you mentioned the rotational use of ploughing. Has that actually shown itself as a decline in the seed bank blackgrass?
We think so. I mean, it's very difficult to measure, but it's part of the big picture. Yeah. Talk about Richard roguing something that we have done for the last 3 years, very much with a focus on, it sounds a bit the wrong way round, but very much focusing on our clean fields. So those that you drive past and think that's spotless, they're the ones to get the roguing gang in. So you have actually got a 0 seed return. That's when we found you can then look at possibly reducing your inputs in the next crop. Putting a roguing gang into a field that's got big patches is it's not a waste of time, but it's not a very cost-effective way of managing the problem we've found.
And it is, what you're alluding to is it's a long-term approach. It's bringing in the rotational uses of ploughing, it's increasing the amount of spring cropping, and also bringing the roging gands in to get the best result. And I quite agree with you, where there's a chance of a roging gang getting completely on top of the problem, that's probably where you should focus.
Absolutely, and that's very much been our approach. We haven't really got to the stage where we were able to move away from a really robust pre-emergence and post-emergence regime in winter cereals, but it's, you know, as you say, it's a long-term.
It is.
It's a long-term thing.
Good.
And we wanted to also ask if you got your T0 planned on time.
No, unfortunately not. No, the weather has really not been with us for the last, well, all spring it seems. So no, unfortunately our T0, well, it was planned, the chemical arrived, and it was never applied. So we took the decision about 2 weeks ago to leave the T0 and, well, not pull the T1 forward, but to just, by the time that we got round the T0s, crops would be at the T1 stage in any case. It then, it's frustrating really. We made that decision, and then there was a bit of a cool spell. Crops that had began to show leaf 3 was beginning to emerge. That really sort of then steadied up. But we have started T1s on some of the most forward crops, including the one we're stood in now, towards the end of last week. And leaf 3's sort of at that stage was 50-60% emerged, so I'm reasonably happy with that timing, and now we're just hopeful for a window at the end of this week where we can get the rest of those applied.
And Andy, this is a key time for fungicides, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as Tom's just explained, you know, the challenges of this season and the frustrations of not being able to get on have meant that maybe, you know, little changes to an approach are needed. You know, I think certainly listening to what varieties Tom's got in the ground, he's got. You know, we're talking main issue here is septoria. You've got quite a bit of varietal resistance built into the varieties broadly that you're growing. So that's a big positive. But you know, I still firmly believe that with septoria you should be ahead of the disease. I mean we should look at the varietal resistance and think that enables us to you know, it takes the pressure off a little bit because you're getting that help there. But really you should always be looking to lay down protection and keep ahead of it. And multi-site contact protectants are a valuable part of that. And of course, you know, Adama has Folpet. Many people using chlorothalonil, but these things are particularly effective at getting ahead of the disease, and then you're building in the other components of azole and SDHI around that. And interestingly, I think at the start of the season there would have been quite a few people questioning whether the SDHI component should go in T1 on certain varieties in certain situations. I mean, that was my feeling, that people were really looking to justify that component. I'm getting the feeling that around the country it's not the same everywhere, but particularly where if people haven't been able to get on with those T0s, you know, we have unprotected crop, and clearly I think more robust generally T1s are actually going on. And you know, they're involving multi-site, azole and SDHI. And then as I alluded to before, it's going to be interesting about that timing, because I think if you're going in and you've got a robust T1 and you've got some varietal resistance and your timing at T1 is about bang on with leaf 3, you know, just about out there, then you're looking at that interval then up to T2, and you're thinking about how long is that going to be and have I got enough protection. If you've gone a little bit early, as we talked about before, that gap might be longer than 3 weeks. You may want to think about perhaps coming back in. And I think also where nitrogen, there's been quite a bit of fertility going on, and then we had that rapid growth. Crops are going to be potentially quite leggy this year, and PGRs are going to be a bit of a challenge. Is that your feeling, Tom? That
to be honest, with missing T0, we were walking crops and seeing clean canopies sort of three or 4 weeks ago, and my main concern with missing T0 was the PGR element. We use an awful lot of sewage sludge, chicken muck. We're on pretty heavy clay, quite fertile soils. So we've always been looking to get a very robust PGR program on. And obviously we're now into May, and the vast majority of our winter wheat crop hasn't had any PGR element to it yet, so that is a concern, and I'm pretty sure hopefully conditions will allow that we'll be able to go back at that sort of T1.5 timing and top up the PGR.
And that I guess would present an opportunity if you felt it was justified to drop in a multi-site.
Yeah, absolutely, and that gives a chance to be a little bit reactive, as you say. I mean, the field we're in, this lily had its T1 towards the end of last week, and this has received a mix of Priory Extra, Seguris, with a bit of Folpet, as you're alluding to. So hopefully, that's quite a robust combination. So we're hoping that whilst there is a bit of septoria about in here, hopefully we're on the right track.
Yeah, absolutely. It is actually really interesting for me to look into this crop because it is lily, so not the most susceptible variety, but we are actually seeing, septoria is very easy to see on the bottom leaves, but it's also getting up the plant, isn't it? But as you say, you've got your T1 on, and it's a robust T1. And so it should be really protecting, leaf 3 now going forward and leaves coming out. So that's pretty promising. Interesting that this has had IZM. It's a very very persistent SDHI. So it'd be interesting to see how that that persistent nature of that added protection hopefully translates through to the T2 timing.
Excellent. Well, David, I want to come back to one of the areas we heard about from our young growers earlier, and that's the topic of weed mapping. What would your advice to listeners be on that?
Well, I'm a great supporter of weed mapping. If you don't know where the weeds are, which weeds they are, and whether those areas are growing or decreasing or staying static, then you can't adequately plan, in my view. So I would encourage people where they can to get weed mapping done. The obvious ones are possibly the ones where there are already degrees of resistance. So I'm thinking of blackgrass, kiwi to get mapped. It could also be ryegrass. Then we start talking about wild oats. ADAS are doing free sampling, or free analysis I should say, for resistance in brome this year. So it's a problem we need to keep on top of. There are broadleaf weeds as well with confirmed resistance, so we could possibly look at those. Slightly later in the year, it would be very apparent where resistant poppies have come through, because they're big and they're red and they wave at you, so it's very easy to see. But there are problems to a lesser degree with chickweed as well, and there are some areas with mayweed resistance. So I would urge people where control has been less good than anticipated. There are a number of reasons, admittedly. It's not immediately jump to the resistance being the problem, but investigate it, get the seed tested if you can. Once we get into the end of this month and into June, then where there are patches of grass weeds, you can see them quite easily above the crop canopy. That's an ideal time to start mapping. Once that seed starts to ripen, which tends to be into July, for wild oats it can be even slightly later than that, then take some of that seed and send it away for resistance testing. So weed mapping is the start of that. As I've said before, you need to know your enemy, so you need to know which ones they are, where they are, and as I've already said, whether those areas are increasing, decreasing or static.
Okay, well, we'll carry on our chat with Tom, Andy and David shortly, as we're going to be looking at the best ways to assess control of grass weeds from autumn and early spring applications. But before that, as I mentioned earlier, yesterday I found out a little bit more about the Rural Youth Project when I called and spoke to Sarah Allison, who is based just north of Dundee in Scotland, and I started by asking about the aims of the initiative.
So the aim really is to gain a greater understanding of young people between the ages of 18 and 28 who are living in rural country locations, so that we can grow an evidence base, that we can drive a change in these communities. It's no hidden fact that the amount of young people living in rural areas has decreased greatly over the last few years. So what we're doing just now isn't working. So what we want to do is develop the options, the can-dos that can change that. So my specific role is as a vlogger. So I'm going to be vlogging along with 20 other rural young people from around the world, sort of documenting my experiences of living in a rural area. So we also have a survey that's available for people to fill in just now, where you can give us some information on what your experience is of living in rural areas, and what we want to do is present that to policymakers and the wider industry so that we can help them give solutions to some of these rural issues. There's never been such a comprehensive set of research done to actually garner the views of young people and ask them what is it that they like and dislike about living in a rural area, and what barriers does living in that rural area give them in their day-to-day lives.
That's brilliant. And you mentioned about doing your vlogging, which I've watched the first one on the website, but also reading about your own background and profile. I know you've got a personal interest in this. Do you want to just share with our listeners some of that background and why you wanted to get involved?
Yeah, so I grew up on the family farm. So we're a hill farm just in the Pentland Hills, a very, very beautiful part of Scotland. We are about 25 miles west of Edinburgh, but about as central gets, really. And although we lived quite close to Scotland's capital city, I probably spent more time when I was growing up speaking to sheep and horses during any break from school in the summer holidays than I did other people, because it is a very remote location. We are 3 miles up a single track road from the nearest hamlet of 3 other houses, never mind anywhere else. So very rural, and that did bring its challenges. I went to a small primary school. At one point there was only 20 tellers in the whole school, 2 classrooms. When I went to high school, I left school when I was 16 after sitting my hires. But the reasoning behind that was when I sat my 5 hires, when I came back to do my subject selection for my final year of high school, they're the subjects that I would take in at advanced hire, which is the equivalent of your A-levels, they weren't offering them because there weren't enough people that wanted to take them, because it was quite a small high school. So I was very limited in the subjects that I could take for my final year. So I ended up leaving school early and going to work before going to university instead of finishing school. And that was purely an issue with living in a rural area. So left school after my 5th year, went to work in the family farms. We had a butchery. I worked there for a year before going to agricultural college for 4 years to study renewable technology and agriculture. And I've worked in agriculture ever since, mainly as a consultant, as a business consultant, but also in knowledge transfer. And so I've only ever lived and worked in the rural area. It's living in the cities never something that's appealed to me.
But you've had this interest in terms of young farmers from quite an early age as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I got involved with the young farmers from the age of 14 as the rite of passage for many young people living in rural farms. And that probably accumulated in 2015 when I became chair of the Agri and Rural Affairs Committee, which has a specific aim of growing the voice of young people in agriculture and rural Scotland. And that's what I think we've done very well. I like to think we've changed the expectation that young people will have a say in their decision making. When I started in these meetings, attending a lot of the policy meetings, I'd be the youngest person in the room, not just by years, but sometimes by decades. And it was a very new thing to have a young person there. And so often what people were talking about was they would be saying, well, we should be hearing from the young people. It's about their future. and I'd be the only young person in the room. So it's something that I feel quite passionately about, that young people should have a say. We shouldn't just make assumptions. We should give them the opportunity to be in these important meetings and actually at the heart of policy making, rather than just as a sideline and actually just making assumptions about their life. I think asking them and demonstrating experience can be so valuable.
And I understand you're off to Brussels next week on that topic.
Yes, so both Rebecca and I, Rebecca from the Rural Youth Project, are going to speak at a European Network of Rural Development workshop on social inclusion, specifically looking at young people and how policymakers and the wider European rural development industry can be more socially inclusive to young people and speak alongside a whole host of different initiatives from around Europe about what they have done. So Rebecca's going to be presenting on the Rural Youth Project, and I'm going to be speaking about the Agri and Rural Affairs Committee with the young farmers and how we grew that to what it is now, and how we can demonstrate and how we can be more socially inclusive towards young people. What actions can you take in your sort of working day life to make sure that you're not putting up artificial barriers to including young people in your projects and in your sort of working environment.
That's fantastic. And so what would your message be to young people to attract them into agriculture?
For young people, I think it's about demonstrating the possibilities. So often I think people associate rural areas or farming with actually physically being out there doing the work in a tractor in a field. But actually the wider industry needs young people as well. We need accountants, we need communications professionals, we need bankers that all have a fundamental understanding of running a rural business, living in rural areas and working in agriculture. So don't assume that agricultural industry is not for you if you don't want to be physically on the ground farming. There are so many other options, and we desperately need young people coming into the industry, not just to farm, but for these other jobs as well.
Well, Sarah, this has been absolutely brilliant. If any listeners want to find out more about the Rural Youth Project, where's the best place for them to go?
So if you search the Twitter handle, the Rural Youth Project, or www.ruralyouthproject.com, or contact Jane Craigie and Rebecca Dawes from Jane Craigie Marketing, who initiated the project, they'll be able to give you some more information, and you'll be able to watch all the vlogs from around the world, as it's not just Scottish and people based in the UK that are undertaking this. We've got some fantastic vloggers from different parts of rural America, Australia, Canada. So it's a truly international project, which is quite exciting as well, because it's a real opportunity to learn from each other as well as from and demonstrating our own experience.
That's tremendous. Well, good luck with the project. Hope the trip to Brussels goes well as well. But for now, Sarah
Thank
Allison,
you.
That's all right. Thanks for joining the podcast. Tom, just hearing what Sarah had to say. I mean, you grew up on a farm yourself, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. And you know, I always look back on it as you know, being a wholly positive experience. I think we're very lucky to grow up in a rural environment. You know, lots of open space, plenty of opportunity to go out and enjoy yourself. But that said, you know, it can be quite an isolated existence. Yet the Young Farmers organisation is a great one. I was involved a little bit with that locally, and it's a great way of getting people together and socialising and learning a lot of life skills that can be useful later on.
And of course, potentially lead you into to becoming an award winner on the farm, I should say. Something I didn't mention on my intro, but you've recently won a bronze for the first Yen Milling Wheat Quality Awards. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and what it means to get that recognition amongst your peers in the industry?
Well, it was a bit of a surprise, really. It was a nice thing to do. I did feel a little bit of a fraud, if I'm honest, because we're not long established milling wheat growers. But those entries into the Yen competition that were milling varieties were automatically entered into the quality award, and it was judged purely on the milling characteristics of those samples. We were, you know, it's quite nice to show that actually the science behind the inputs and the approach that we've taken on that crop is born into fruition, and that we are producing something that our end market wants and is of the spec that they require. I think it's quite easy when you're growing we're essentially just growing commodity products, but it's something that we've looked at in the last few years here is, are there any opportunities for us to add value on those commodity products, whether it be for local markets or for buyback contracts, such as we're contracted with all our milling wheat to Warburtons, so which has been good for us, and hopefully it's good for the end user as well.
Well, listen, it's good to win any award, isn't it?
Yeah,
So congratulations on that. Now, as I mentioned before our interview with Sarah, we wanted to discuss the best ways of assessing control of grass weeds from autumn and early spring applications. David, any advice to give here?
It comes down to getting out in the fields and making sure that you know what results the previously applied herbicides are giving you, because that's going to help form the next steps. So you need to, everybody keeps good records these days, I'm sure, so you need to have a record of which products were used, at what rate, at what timing. I'm a great advocate, if we think about blackgrass control programs, that you have to have a pre-emergence down. So you need probably 240 grams minimum flufenicet in that pre-emergence. And then if it's anything like a significant blackgrass pressure, you're going to be looking to come back in with an early post-emergence. So that's probably targeting the blackgrass at 1 or 2 leaves, no later than that. And then come springtime, you need to be assessing the performance of those products and seeing what levels of control you've achieved. It's a little bit peculiar this season. We know the weather's all over the place, that's affected the crops, but it's equally affected the amount of additional germination of blackgrass over winter. From what I've been seeing in commercial crops and in our own trials, the germination of blackgrass pretty much stopped in November time, and there's been very little since then. As we come into the spring, we're already in May now, we are just hearing about a little bit more germination of blackgrass. There's always a bit of a spring peak, not a very significant one compared with the autumn, but that is much later than we would normally have seen it. Normally when we do assessments in trials, we can do assessments in February, March, and in the untreated areas of the trial, there will have been more blackgrass germination. That hasn't happened in our trials over winter this year. So part of that planning is to get out. Don't think because you checked your fields to see how good the blackgrass programme was and you checked it in February, March, that that's the final level of control. The key to it obviously is heading, which we're going to be a little bit behind this year, but not significantly. The crops catch up, the weeds catch up. But traditionally, getting towards the end of this month, the end of May, where you have a problem where the blackgrass has been inadequately controlled or other grass weeds, they will start poking out through the top of the canopy. So you need to then reassess where the programme has worked, where it perhaps hasn't worked as well as you'd hoped, and what amendments you can then make.
And as we move towards autumn, what about techniques that listeners should be using in terms of identification, things like brome species?
For bromes, once those panicles come out in May time, then that's a key timing for me to aid identification. There are probably five main species in the UK that are causing problems, some to a greater or lesser degree than others. Sterile brome or barren brome remains the most widely spread. There has been monitoring of this for a couple of years now, and it's continuing again this year. But the key consideration in getting the identification right is subsequent cultivations in the autumn. Now what I'm alluding to is that with sterile brome, which is, as I've said, the most common, and great brome, light induces dormancy. So when the seed sheds, if it lays on the soil surface and is subjected to light, then that can induce dormancy in that seed, which can perpetuate the problem. Conversely, with meadow brome, soft brome and rye brome, which admittedly aren't as widespread but do cause significant problems where they occur, the best advice thinking about cultivation's approach is to leave them on the surface because actually burial induces dormancy. So if you get them into the soil profile quickly, there's a greater likelihood of increased dormancy with those. So the easiest time for me is to look at the panicles. There can be confusion between a large sterile brome plant and great brome, but if you do the identification properly with the panicle, you shouldn't get into too much trouble.
Okay, so to finish off the episode, Andy, any last advice to give?
Yeah, I think I think just walking this crop, I can see here we've got quite a lot of latent septoria that's manifesting itself, and I don't think this is going to be an isolated case. I think we could be seeing quite a bit of this with the rain we've had in wide parts of the country. It's kind of just a little bit of a warning to say, keep monitoring your crops. I really think this is a season where it's more and more about almost dealing with fields on a field by field basis. Taking all those risk factors into account: drilling date, variety, what have you done so far, when did you do it, and monitoring the crop. I think curative activity could be pretty crucial this year. So you're wanting maximum curative activity from your azels and your SDHIs, and we don't know what the weather's going to do up to T2, and at T2 we'll want curative activity, but at the same time, one of my messages would be, from a resistance management point of view and disease control for septoria, include multi-site contact protectants. And when you get to T2, if you've got a concern, and I know there is, because there's a suggestion that quite a lot of T2 applications to wheat don't include a multi-site. If you have concern about chlorothalonil being antagonistic to partner products and affecting the curative activity, there is an option. Folpet doesn't interfere, it's not antagonistic, and so there's really, I would say, that's not an excuse for not including a multi-site contact protectant. They really do protect single site mode of action chemistry against resistance, and they're quite vital. So I'd really say to people, just ensure multi-sites are in there.
Okay, well, thanks for that, and that's it actually for another episode of ArableAware. So thanks once again to David Roberts and Andy Bailey of Adama for joining me here, and of course to Tom Peabody here at Mill Farm. I hope our listeners can pick up all the sounds of the birds and the sheep here, but we'll take some photos and share that on our social media channels, because it really is been a beautiful morning and very different to the last time we were out recording a podcast in the snow. Don't forget, you can subscribe to updates and automatic downloads of this podcast by going to uk.information-hub.adama.com/ArableAware, or much simpler, just go to adama.com/UK/EN and search for podcast, and you should find it easily. But you can also subscribe to the show on podcast platforms such as iTunes and Spotify. Just search for ArableAware and type that all in using one word, so ArableAware, and you should find us. And if you do, please do give us a positive rating and review, as that helps us climb the podcast charts and means more people get to hear us. Don't forget, if you've got anything you want to comment on or want us to cover off in future episodes, then please get in touch either on the Hub, on our Facebook page, or via Twitter using @AdamaUK_, or simply email us at ukinquiries@adama.com. But for now, thanks for listening and goodbye.